Ukraine and its main European allies are pressing Russia to accept a 30-day ceasefire to take effect on Monday. The leaders of Germany, Poland, France and the UK travelled to Kyiv for talks with President Zelenskyy and also spoke to Donald Trump by phone in Washington. The allies are threatening Russia with increased sanctions if it fails to comply.
An unprecedented show of unity as the leaders of Kyiv's key European backers lay candles at a memorial to fallen Ukrainian soldiers. It's the first time the heads of government from Germany, France, the UK and Poland have all gathered with President Volodymyr Zelenskyy in his homeland. They're backing a 30-day truce in the war with Russia, originally proposed by the United States in March. Germany's new Chancellor Friedrich Merz is aiming to bring fresh momentum to the peace process.
It
must be clear that if Russia refuses this ceasefire, a ceasefire that could serve as the basis for immediate negotiations, then we will continue to defend Ukraine and we will continue to increase pressure on Russia.
Strong words from the so-called coalition of the willing. The leaders threaten Vladimir Putin with massive new sanctions unless he agrees to the proposed ceasefire.
An unconditional ceasefire, rejecting Putin's conditions, and clear that if he turns his back on peace, we will respond, working with President Trump, with all our partners. We will ramp up sanctions and increase our military aid for Ukraine's defence to pressure Russia back to the table.
The Kremlin said Vladimir Putin is ready for talks with any leaders, and it criticised the coalition's approach.
We hear a lot of contradictory statements from Europe. They're generally confrontational in nature, rather than aimed at trying to revive our relations. Nothing more.
The Kremlin says it will consider the ceasefire proposal. But Europe's leaders are all too aware that unless there's significant progress towards peace in Ukraine, Donald Trump says he'll simply walk away.
All right, well, for more, let's speak to Clifford May, founder and president of the FDD, Foundation for Defence of Democracies, a think tank in Washington, D.C. Great to have you on DW News. So how is the United States, where you are, viewing this visit to Kyiv by European leaders and this proposed 30-day truce?
I would say encouraging. I think it's very good to see the unity of the European allies with the Trump administration on this, on the same page. The key word you're hearing is pressure. Threatening pressure is very important. Actually applying pressure, that's what it's going to take to get Vladimir Putin to actually agree to a ceasefire. He hasn't done so. The President Trump started back a couple of months ago saying he wanted an unconditional ceasefire. And of course, what you hear from spokesman Peskov and from Putin is, yeah, well, there are nuances, there are conditions, there's this and that. Maybe we will, and then they don't. So to see the allies all together is very important, very useful. But they have to do more than urge. They have to do more than threaten pressure. They have to do exactly what Sir Keir Starmer was saying. I think they will need to apply real economic pressure and increase the munitions going to Ukraine.
Now, that alliance, we'll say, has been tested, we'll say, recently. So what's your take on European leaders, including Donald Trump, in this call?
Oh, I think it's only useful for America and its West European allies and East European allies to be on the same page, singing from the same hymnal, as we say, having the same policy towards Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin would love to have a divide, to be able to have a divide between the Americans and the Europeans. That's not what we're seeing right now. I think that's very important. I think it's encouraging. I think it's very useful. I think it's necessary if we are going to get to a ceasefire. And keep in mind, I don't consider a ceasefire the same as peace or even a path to peace, but it stops the killing and it allows for other possibilities to occur through negotiations or even through a long-term frozen conflict, which may be where this could be headed, which is not the worst thing for Ukraine.
Now, this visit was just days after the swearing in of Germany's new Chancellor, Friedrich Merz. Were the other three European leaders waiting for the new leader of Germany to join them?
I don't know. I think it's certainly possible. I certainly found myself encouraged by the new chancellor, by what he's saying, by the seriousness of his attitude, by the fact that he is in Kyiv with his peers. I'm looking forward to a Germany that is very active, that is contributing to the collective defense, that is taking the Russian aggression against Ukraine very seriously, and I think that's what I'm seeing from Chancellor Merz. As an American, I'm very encouraged by what I'm seeing.
Let's get the thoughts of Doug Klain from the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center in Washington, D.C. Good to have you with us, Doug. First, just looking at this visit, what was your initial assessment?
This is a big deal. For months, I think we have seen the United States trying to go it alone in achieving some kind of a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. And Trump hasn't had much luck, just demanding a ceasefire, demanding a peace deal. But what we're seeing today is something we haven't seen in quite some time. The United States and the rest of Europe speaking with perhaps one voice, calling for an unconditional ceasefire and threatening new sanctions and aid to Ukraine if Russia doesn't agree. The onus to act is really on Russia now. Ukraine has said yes to all of Trump's proposals for months, and Trump reportedly is happy with this outcome after getting a call from these European leaders today to report on this. The U.S. has sanctions that are ready to go if Trump gives the green light. And I think everybody's going to be waiting to see by Monday, does Russia agree and finally implement a ceasefire?
I suppose that's the key question because, Donald Trump had taken a different stance with Russia before, and then now he seems to be aligning with the European leaders, at least that's what it seems. But do you think he was all along in the loop, or, what role did he play in this particular situation that we've just seen?
I think we'll learn more in the coming days about, how involved Trump has been in this process. But he's been somewhat consistent in this demand for a stop to the fighting. He's, tried to push for a bigger peace deal. He's tried to push for more discreet ceasefires in the air, in the Black Sea, and now an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. That's the one that he seems to have settled on. Ukraine has agreed to it without any conditions, and the rest of Europe is backing Ukraine on this. Putin really is the only one that has not agreed to that. And from some of the reporting that we've seen, Trump was happy with this call from European leaders and felt like they have backed his proposal for a ceasefire again. I think that angling of presenting this as Trump's idea helps to garner his support for the initiative.
And just looking at the timing, do you think the sort of strategic, waiting for Germany to have its new chancellor in place, presumably?
Absolutely. Any kind of peace deal, any kind of significant support for Ukraine, Germany really has to play a role in this. And now that Germany has a government, has a chancellor, and can really help to lead on this, I think that Europe's hand is stronger. As we look at any kind of future security agreement, security guarantees for Ukraine, Germany has a really crucial role to play in that.
Doug, just very quickly before we end the conversation, Friedrich Merz, German Chancellor, has talked about tough sanctions on Russia if Putin doesn't accept this ceasefire. Is that message likely to get through?
I think so. I think that Putin has been certainly stringing Trump along, and we're seeing some exasperation from the U.S. side now. And I think that Europe is, while support has continued for the last couple of months from the rest of Europe to Ukraine, I think that there has not been a really big united package of sanctions with the United States and with Europe against Russia in quite some time. The time is ripe for that, especially with EU sanctions in need of renewal at the end of July. And if those sanctions aren't renewed, one of the effects of that is that hundreds of billions in frozen Russian state assets could be unfrozen and given back to Russia. So the time is really now to act.
Doug Klain from the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Let's go to Kyiv now and bring in DW correspondent Nick Connolly. Nick, great to see you. So did these four visiting leaders accomplish what they set out to do in the Ukrainian capital?
They certainly put Vladimir Putin in a difficult position. They put him on the spot. They said, either you agree to a 30-day ceasefire from coming Monday without any preconditions, or basically you take responsibility for this war carrying on, for the death toll, and basically will have not only pressure from Europe but also from the US administration. That was basically the point of all this. There was lots of talk of unity. There was a real sense that all the messages had been kind of well calibrated and kind of harmonized. And there was also constant reference to the US, basically giving thanks to Donald Trump for having kind of initially put out this idea of a 30-day ceasefire. And certainly there is now a real expectation that either, Putin will blink and have to agree to this at least for some time, or he will then bear the responsibility and be in a lot more difficult kind of diplomatic position than he was up to this.
Nick, you mentioned President Trump there, and let's talk about the phone call with him. How vital is it to have him in the loop?
Well, certainly I think this is about, from a Ukrainian perspective, at least getting all the US military aid that was promised by the previous administration, which is still being processed and handed over, to avoid him stopping that. And it's also about intelligence gathering. Even if Europe is going to basically take on the major role in any kind of post-war solution, any kind of peacekeeping mission, without that US intelligence, those satellites, it is going to be very difficult to basically police any kind of ceasefire, to be able to tell who fired first. So you could get a real sense from those European leaders that they are desperate to keep Trump in the boat and to avoid him getting bored of this whole kind of bigger negotiation effort. And they're trying to basically, give him what he wants, give him the recognition and the kind of praise, in the hope that that keeps him and US resources on Ukraine's side.
What do you know about Russia's reaction to the US-European peace initiative? Is there a chance that Moscow will actually agree to the 30-day truce?
So the first reaction we got was on X by the former President Dmitry Medvedev, who is known for his pretty extreme language often enough, and he was scathing about this, basically accusing the West of trying to put Russia under pressure and saying that they could stuff their deal. Now we've had more considered tones since then from Putin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who's basically said that this is something that Russia has wanted all along, the Ukrainians weren't playing along, and that when it comes to this now offer today, that Russia will still think about it. But I think it is going to be very, very difficult for the Russians. The expectation from experts you talk to here in Ukraine is that maybe Russia will eventually feel that it needs to go along with this, that it will sign up, and then a couple of days down the line accuse Ukraine of breaking the terms of this deal and then go back to open warfare. We've certainly seen that these previous short-term ceasefires, that's one still in place right now, it's meant an end to attacks on places like Kyiv. The missiles haven't been flying, but certainly along the front lines it hasn't changed anything. So there is real skepticism here in Ukraine that Vladimir Putin is going to be willing to really end this war, but certainly they want the West to kind of accept the Ukrainian position that this is Ukraine that is up for peace and Russia that wants to carry on fighting.
Now, Nick, the European leaders announced coordinated sanctions if Russia doesn't agree to the ceasefire. So what could that look like, and will it have any effect on Russia?
There is obviously a lot of cynicism about sanctions given that Russia is already under so many. But on the other hand, when the Russians go and talk to Trump and his people, the first thing that they always talk about is sanctions being taken off. They have made fighting this war a lot more expensive for Russia, and they have reduced Russia's income from energy exports. So there is a sense that there could be more, maybe secondary sanctions targeting the countries buying resources from Russia and the countries that helped Russia to get around sanctions on technology. But it's also about upping the weapons deliveries to Ukraine. And there was a sense there from those European leaders here that they would do more to give Ukraine more in a hurry, to actually give something Russia to feel on the battlefield in a hurry.
Always great to have your insights, Nick. DW correspondent Nick Connolly in Kyiv for us. Thank you.